He's gone. Mother! Pa fell into the ravine. His neck snapped instantly. Samuel spoke with a trembling voice. Daniel wept beside him. But I knew they were lying. Thunder Tom's loyal stallion would never throw his rider. And beneath that canvas in the wagon, I was certain, did not lie my husband's body. I am Elizabeth Clearwater, wife, mother. Bridge between cultures. But in that instant, I became something else, an avenger. A woman betrayed by her own flesh and blood. The enemies were no longer faceless railroad men or greedy speculators. They were my children, my sons, whose souls had been sold to greed and power. From that moment, I understood the cruel truth survival meant confronting my own blood. Either I would expose them for the murderers they were, or I would die at their hands. What would you do if you discovered your own children were your deadliest enemies? How far would you go to protect the community that raised them? In 1887, Wyoming Territory, where justice rode on horseback and mercy was a luxury few could afford, one frontier woman was about to find out. This is my story. This is our story. This is the story of what happens when good people refuse to let evil have the final word. My name is Elizabeth Clearwater, though the Lakota side of my family knew me as Winona, firstborn daughter. At 58, I had learned to walk between two worlds with equal grace, honoring both my mother's Anglo heritage and my father's Lakota blood. Our ranch in Wyoming Territory had become a bridge between cultures, where respect flowed as freely as the creek that gave us our name. The morning of October 15th, 1887 began like countless others. Dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson as I stepped onto our wooden porch, breathing in the crisp air that carried the scent of sagebrush and distant snow. Tom was already down at the corrals, his tall frame silhouetted against the sunrise as he checked our prize horses with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent 40 years working this land. Morning. My heart, he called out in the mixture of English and Lakota phrases that had become our private language over 26 years of marriage. Tom had learned my father's tongue out of respect, just as I'd embraced his Anglo ways while never abandoning my own. I smiled and waved, then turned back inside to prepare breakfast according to the traditions my Lakota grandmother had taught me. Cornmeal cakes, wild honey, and strong coffee, foods that nourished both body and spirit. The kitchen still held shadows from the oil lamps, but I preferred working in the gentle half-light of dawn, when the world felt most peaceful. As I ground corn in the stone bowl my Uncle Joseph Running Bear had carved for my wedding, I heard Tom's boots on the porch steps. He entered with that quiet authority that had made him both a respected rancher and an effective sheriff for Clearwater Township. His badge caught the lamplight as he hung his hat on the wooden peg by the door. "Smells like home," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted of morning air and honest work, though I suspect Joseph would say you're still too heavy-handed with the honey. "Uncle Joseph says many things," I replied with mock sternness, "but he never refuses a second helping." We both laughed, remembering how my uncle, a traditional Lakota elder who served as our spiritual advisor, had an unexpected weakness for sweet foods despite his stern lectures about moderation. Tom settled into his chair at our handmade pine table, and I noticed the small furrow between his brows that appeared when something troubled him. After so many years together, I could read his expressions like tracks in fresh snow. "What weighs on your mind this morning?" I asked, setting his coffee before him in the blue ceramic mug I'd bought from the traveling merchant last spring. He sipped thoughtfully before answering. "Had some visitors yesterday while you were helping Doc Hayes with the Miller baby. Railroad men, asking questions about our land boundaries, water rights, that sort of thing. Seemed mighty interested in our grazing permits." My hands stilled on the serving spoon. "Railroad men. The Union Pacific already has their route through Laramie. Why would they care about ranch land this far north?" That's what I wondered too. They mentioned something about a spur line, bringing cattle cars closer to the smaller ranches, said it would make us all rich. Tom's voice carried the skepticism of a man who'd learned that strangers bearing promises of easy wealth usually brought trouble instead. I served the cornmeal cakes, still warm from the cast iron skillet, and settled across from him. "Did they speak with Samuel and Daniel about this?" Tom's expression darkened slightly. "That's another thing troubling me. Beth, our boys weren't here to help with the evening chores again. Third time this week. Samuel sent word through young Tommy Martinez that they had business in town. But what business keeps a man away from his family's ranch 3 nights running?" The concern in his voice matched my own growing unease. "Samuel. our eldest at 32, had always been ambitious, but lately his ambition seemed to pull him away from the values Tom and I had tried to instill. Daniel, 29 and forever following his older brother's lead, had grown equally distant. Both boys had inherited my Lakota features: high cheekbones, dark hair, and eyes the color of winter storms. But lately those eyes held a coldness I didn't recognize. Perhaps they're courting, I suggested, though without much conviction. Samuel had married Victoria Ashford 2 years ago, a pale, sharp-featured woman from back east who made no secret of her disdain for our primitive lifestyle. Daniel remained unmarried, claiming no woman in the territory met his standards, though I suspected his standards had more to do with money than character. Tom reached across the table and covered my hand with his calloused palm. Maybe so. But I've been sheriff long enough to recognize when men are hiding something. Our sons have been meeting with those same railroad fellows. Beth saw them coming out of the cattleman's hotel yesterday morning, thick as thieves. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October morning. You think they're planning something without telling us? I think they're planning something they know we wouldn't approve of. Tom's voice carried the weight of a father's disappointment. This ranch has been in our family, your family and mine both, for over 20 years. We've built something here that honors both our peoples. If those railroad men are offering easy money for our land... He didn't need to finish. We both knew how seductive such offers could be to young men who'd grown restless with the steady, honest work of ranching. Samuel had always chafed at what he called our backwards ways, and Victoria's constant complaints about their modest cabin had only made things worse. Daniel, ever eager to impress his older brother, would follow Samuel into any scheme that promised quick wealth. After Tom rode out to check the northern pastures, I stood on our porch watching his figure disappear into the morning mist. Something cold settled in my chest, a feeling my Lakota grandmother would have called a shadow vision, a glimpse of trouble coming like storm clouds over the mountains. I tried to shake it off as I hitched our mare Spotted Dawn to the buckboard, but the sensation clung to me like morning frost. The 2-mile journey into Clearwater Township usually brought me peace. Today, every familiar landmark seemed to whisper warnings. The old cottonwood where Tom had first kissed me looked skeletal against the pale sky. The creek that gave us our name ran lower than usual, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Clearwater Township sat in a natural bowl between rolling hills, a haven I'd helped build into something rare, a place where Lakota wisdom and Anglo determination had learned to dance together instead of fight. 400 souls of every color and creed had found refuge here, bound together by Tom's fair justice and what folks called my gift for bridging worlds. But as I guided Spotted Dawn down Main Street, I noticed things that made my warrior woman heart, the part of me that was pure Lakota, start beating the rhythm of approaching battle. My first stop was the telegraph office, where Marcus Webb looked up from his key with eyes that held secrets. He was a nervous man on good days, but today he practically vibrated with anxiety. "Mrs. Clearwater," he said, his voice cracking like a boy's. I've been hoping you'd come by. There's something eating at my conscience like a cancer." The formal way he spoke, so different from his usual stammering friendliness, sent ice through my veins. "What troubles you?" "Marcus." He glanced around like a hunted animal, then leaned across his counter until I could smell the fear sweat on him. "Ma'am, I've been sending telegrams that make my skin crawl. Messages about land surveys, about removing obstacles, about making stubborn ranchers see reason." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Some of those messages mentioned your ranch by name, and they were signed by your son Samuel." The world tilted sideways. My hands gripped his counter so hard my knuckles went white. What exactly did these messages say? Things like old man getting suspicious, need to accelerate timeline, and mother's Indian connections could be useful for legitimizing claims. "Mrs. Clearwater, they're talking about you and Sheriff Clearwater like you're problems to be solved." Problems to be solved. My own son discussing his parents like obstacles in a business transaction. The betrayal hit me deeper than a knife wound, not just because Samuel was plotting against us, but because he was using my Lakota heritage as a tool in his scheme. I left the telegraph office moving like a woman in a dream, but my mind was sharp as winter wind. At Chenway's general store, I bought supplies while studying my friend's face. Chenway had survived the California gold fields, railroad construction camps, and anti-Chinese violence. He knew how to read danger. "You look like a woman seeing ghosts," he observed while wrapping my purchases. "Perhaps I am. Chen Wei, I need your honest words about my sons." His expression grew grave. "Samuel and Daniel have been asking questions that make me uncomfortable. Not just about property values, but about you and Tom specifically. How much influence you have with the Lakota families. Whether Tom's sheriff authority extends to tribal matters. What would happen to the ranch if—" He stopped, unable to finish. "If what? If something happened to you both?" The words hung between us like a death sentence. My blood turned to ice water. They asked about that directly. Daniel did. 3 days ago, he said it was for planning purposes. But the way he asked, "Elizabeth, I have seen men plan violence. Your son has that look." Before I could respond, Doc Margaret Hayes burst through the store door, her usually composed face flushed with urgency. "Elizabeth, thank God you're here. I need to speak with you immediately. Privately." We stepped outside, and Margaret grabbed my arm with hands that trembled. "I've just come from treating Jake Morrison, the cowhand who works for the Patterson spread. He was beaten badly, but before he lost consciousness, he said something that chilled me to the bone." "What did he say?" "He said Samuel and Daniel paid him $50 to put something in your well water. When he refused, they had him beaten as a warning to other hired men in the territory. Elizabeth, they're not just planning to cheat you out of your land. They're planning something far worse." The pieces crashed together in my mind like thunder. The mysterious meetings, the railroad connections, the questions about what would happen if Tom and I died, and now an attempt to poison our well. My sons weren't just greedy. They were planning murder. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice shaking. "Jake said he overheard them talking about making it look like an Indian raid gone wrong. They want to blame your death on your own people, Elizabeth. They want to turn your mixed heritage into the weapon that destroys you." I stood there in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the town Tom and I had helped build, realizing that my own children had become my deadliest enemies. They weren't just willing to kill us for money. They were planning to use my Lakota blood to cover their tracks, knowing that many whites would readily believe Indians capable of such violence. As I drove home through the lengthening shadows, one thought burned in my mind brighter than all the others. If Samuel and Daniel were willing to go this far, if they were already recruiting accomplices and planning our deaths, then Tom and I were in immediate danger. Tonight, when my husband returned from the northern pastures, I would have to tell him that our sons had declared war on us. And in this war, there would be no mercy, no family loyalty, no love, only survival. The question that terrified me most wasn't whether they would try to kill us. The question was, would they succeed before we could stop them? I drove home through the gathering dusk with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The buckboard wheels seemed to echo the terrible words Margaret had spoken. They're planning something far worse. Every shadow between the cottonwoods looked like a hiding place for assassins. Every rustle in the sagebrush sounded like footsteps following me home. Spotted Dawn sensed my agitation and kept tossing her head, ears swiveling at sounds I couldn't hear. Animals knew when death was stalking. My grandmother had taught me that. "Easy, girl," I whispered, but my voice shook with the fear I was trying to hide. The ranch appeared ahead, lamplight glowing golden in our kitchen window. Tom had returned from checking the northern pastures and was probably wondering where I'd gone with the buckboard. How could I tell him that our own sons, the babies we'd raised with such love, were planning to murder us both? How could any parent accept such a monstrous truth? I found Tom in the barn, unsaddling his horse, Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with white markings that made him look like he wore war paint. My husband's movements were slow, careful. He'd been favoring his left shoulder since a bronc had thrown him last month, though he'd never admit to the pain. "Beth," he said, looking up with relief. I was starting to worry. "You've been gone most of the day." The words I needed to say stuck in my throat like broken glass. "How do you tell the man you love that death is coming for him instead?" I helped him curry Thunder, my hands shaking as I worked the brush through the stallion's coat. "Tom, we need to talk about Samuel and Daniel, about what they're really doing." He paused in his work, reading the fear in my voice. "What did you learn in town?" I told him everything. Marcus Webb's telegrams, Chen Wei's warnings, Doc Hayes' terrifying news about Jake Morrison. With each revelation, Tom's face grew harder, older, until he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "My own sons," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Planning to kill us for railroad money. It's worse than that. They want to make it look like an Indian raid. Tom, they want to use my heritage to cover their crime, knowing people will believe the worst about my people. Tom's jaw tightened with the cold fury I'd seen him use on outlaws and claim jumpers. Over my dead body. The words sent ice through my veins. Don't say that. Please. He pulled me into his arm, and I breathed in his familiar scent of leather and sage and honest sweat. We'll figure this out. Beth, tomorrow, I'll ride to Fort Laramie and wire the territorial marshal. If our boys want to play with railroad money and hired killers, they'll find out what real law looks like. That night, we barely slept. Every sound outside, the wind in the cottonwoods, an owl's call, the distant howl of coyotes, made us both tense with fear. Tom kept his Winchester within arm's reach, and I had my father's war tomahawk hidden beneath my pillow. We were preparing for a battle we'd never imagined fighting. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost painting the windows like spiderwebs. Tom dressed in his best shirt and his sheriff's badge, preparing for the long ride to Fort Laramie. He strapped on his gun belt with the practiced movements of a man who'd worn it for 20 years, checking his Colt .45 with the same care he'd show a trusted friend. Stay close to the house today, he told me, pulling on his heavy coat. Keep the rifle handy. If anyone comes asking questions, tell them I've gone to Cheyenne on territorial business. I walked him to the porch, where Thunder waited saddled and ready. The morning mist clung to the ground like smoke, making the world look ghostly and unreal. Tom kissed me goodbye, a long, fierce kiss that tasted of coffee and determination and love that had weathered 26 years of frontier hardship. I'll be back tomorrow night, he promised, swinging into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to ride. And when I return, we'll put an end to this madness. I watched him ride away into the mist, his tall figure gradually fading until he looked like a spirit disappearing into the other world. Something in my chest, the part of me that was pure Lakota, connected to the old ways and the ancient warnings, screamed that I would never see him alive again. But I pushed the feeling down and went inside to wait. The day crawled by like a wounded animal. I tried to keep busy with normal tasks, feeding the chickens, mending torn shirts, preparing bread dough for tomorrow's baking, but my hands shook with every task, and my ears strained for sounds that didn't belong, hoofbeats, voices, the crack of gunfire in the distance. It was nearly sunset when I heard riders approaching fast. I grabbed Tom's Winchester from above the fireplace and peered through the kitchen window. 3 horsemen were coming up our lane at a gallop, and my heart nearly stopped when I recognized them. Samuel and Daniel, riding hard, their faces grim with what looked like grief. Behind them rode Dr. Patterson from the next county over, a man I barely knew, which struck me as strange. Why would they bring a doctor I'd never met instead of our friend Doc Hayes? I stepped onto the porch with the rifle in my hands, though I kept it pointed at the ground. My sons reined in their lathered horses and dismounted, their movements sharp with urgency. "Mother," Samuel said, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "We have terrible news." Daniel couldn't seem to speak at all. He stood beside his horse with tears streaming down his face, looking for all the world like a grieving son. "What's happened?" I asked, though my heart already knew. "It's Pa," Samuel said, pulling off his hat in a gesture of respect. "There's been an accident. He's dead. Mother." The rifle slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the porch boards. Even though I'd been expecting this, even though every instinct had warned me, the words still hit like a physical blow. "How?" I whispered. Dr. Patterson stepped forward, a thin man with cold eyes and soft hands that had never done honest work. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Clearwater. Your husband's horse threw him into a ravine about 10 miles north of here. His neck was broken. Death would have been instantaneous." But something was wrong with the story. Thunder was the most sure-footed horse in Wyoming Territory. Tom had ridden him through blizzards and across treacherous mountain passes without incident. The idea that Thunder would throw him into a ravine made no sense at all. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "We brought him home," Daniel said, speaking for the first time. "He's in the back of the wagon." Only then did I notice the wagon following behind their horses. Covered with a canvas tarp, my husband's body lay beneath that canvas, and I would never hear his voice again. never feel his arms around me, never grow old beside him as we'd planned. We need to make arrangements, Samuel said gently. The funeral should be tomorrow. People will want to pay their respects quickly, before, well, before the weather turns. But it was October, not December. The weather was mild and would remain so for weeks. Why the rush to bury Tom before anyone could examine his body too closely? As my sons carried their father's body into our house, laying him on the kitchen table where we'd shared our last breakfast together, I realized with crystal clarity that I was looking at my husband's murderers. They'd killed Tom somewhere on the trail to Fort Laramie, then concocted this story about thunder throwing him, and now they were in my house, pretending to grieve, planning my death next. The war had begun, and I was already losing. The funeral preparations passed in a blur of forced normalcy that felt like walking through a nightmare. Samuel and Daniel moved through our house with practiced grief, making arrangements with the efficiency of men who'd planned every detail in advance. They'd already contacted Reverend Matthews, reserved space in the churchyard, and ordered a simple pine coffin from the carpenter, all before asking what I wanted for my husband's final rest. "We thought you'd prefer something modest," Samuel explained when I questioned the haste. Pa always said he didn't want a fuss made over him. But Tom had never said any such thing. He'd often joked that, when his time came, he wanted the whole territory to know a good man had passed. The rushed, secretive arrangements felt like another insult added to the injury of his murder. I spent the night sitting beside Tom's body, which they'd laid out in our front parlor. In the lamplight, his face looked peaceful, almost as if he were sleeping. But when I touched his hands, hands that had held me, worked beside me, built our life together, they were cold as winter stone. I whispered prayers in both English and Lakota, asking the spirits of both our peoples to guide him safely to the other world. Samuel and Daniel took turns keeping watch, claiming they wanted to honor their father. But I noticed how they positioned themselves between me and the door, how their eyes never quite met mine, how they jumped at every sound from outside. They weren't mourning sons, they were guards, making sure I didn't escape to spread inconvenient truths. The funeral dawned gray and windless, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. By 10 o'clock, nearly the entire population of Clearwater Township had gathered in our small churchyard. I was surprised by the turnout. Tom had been respected, but this seemed like more people than had ever gathered for anything in our town's short history. Chenway stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with genuine sorrow. Doc Hayes wore her best black dress and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. Even some of the Lakota families from the reservation had come, including my Uncle Joseph Running Bear, whose presence gave me strength I desperately needed. Marcus Webb from the telegraph office looked particularly nervous, shifting from foot to foot and glancing repeatedly at Samuel and Daniel. I wondered what role he'd played in this tragedy, whether he'd been bought or simply intimidated into silence. Reverend Matthews spoke beautifully about Tom's life, his service to the community, his role as a bridge between different peoples. But the words felt hollow when I looked at my sons standing beside the grave, their faces masks of appropriate grief while their hearts remained cold as January. "Thomas Clearwater was a man of honor," the Reverend said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "A man who believed in justice, in fairness, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His legacy will live on in the community he helped build, in the peace he helped maintain between all the peoples of this territory. If only he knew that Tom's own sons had destroyed that legacy with their greed and betrayal." As the Reverend spoke about resurrection and eternal life, I found myself studying the faces in the crowd. Who else knew the truth? Who else had been bought or threatened into silence? The weight of isolation pressed down on me like a physical force. I was surrounded by neighbors and friends, yet utterly alone with the knowledge of what had really happened. The ceremony was nearly over when I heard hoofbeats approaching fast. A young rider, one of the Patterson boys from the neighboring ranch, came galloping up the hill toward the churchyard, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Telegraph," he called out, waving a yellow envelope. "Urgent telegraph for Mrs. Clearwater." Samuel stepped forward quickly. "I'll take that for my mother. She's too grief-stricken to deal with business matters." But something in his eagerness made me suspicious. "No," I said firmly, extending my hand. "I'll take my own messages." The Patterson boy looked uncertain, glancing between Samuel and me. In the end, respect for a widow's wishes won out, and he handed the telegram directly to me. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The message inside was brief. Written in the telegraph operator's careful block letters, Elizabeth, stop, I am still alive. Stop, that is not me, in the coffin. Stop, trust no one, stop, especially our sons, stop, Tom. The world tilted sideways. The telegram fell from my numb fingers and fluttered to the ground like a dying bird. Around me, the crowd murmured with concern, but their voices sounded distant and muffled, as if I were hearing them from underwater. Samuel bent quickly to retrieve the telegram, but I was faster. I snatched it up and pressed it against my chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. What does it say, Mother? Daniel asked, his voice tight with what sounded like fear. I looked at my sons, really looked at them, and saw guilt written in every line of their faces. They knew what the telegram said because they knew Tom was still alive somewhere. The body in the coffin was someone else. Some poor soul they'd murdered to cover their tracks. It's from the bank. I lied, my voice barely steady. About settling your father's accounts. But my hands were shaking so violently that several people noticed. Doc Hayes stepped forward with concern. Elizabeth, you're white as a sheet. Perhaps you should sit down. I'm fine, I managed, though I felt anything but fine. My husband was alive, somewhere, somehow. He had survived their attempt to kill him. But if Tom was alive, who was in the coffin we'd just buried? The crowd began to disperse, offering final condolences and promises to check on me in the coming days. But I barely heard them. My mind was racing with questions and possibilities. How had Tom escaped? Where was he hiding? How had he managed to send a telegraph without Samuel and Daniel knowing? And most importantly, if they'd already tried to kill him once and failed? What would they do when they realized he was still alive, as the last mourners walked away? Samuel and Daniel flanked me like guards escorting a prisoner. Come on, Mother, Samuel said, taking my arm with false gentleness. You need to rest. This has been a difficult day for all of us. But I pulled away from his touch. I want to stay here a moment longer, to say goodbye properly. We'll wait with you, Daniel said quickly. No. My voice carried more authority than I'd felt in days. I need to be alone with him, please. They exchanged worried glances but couldn't refuse such a reasonable request without raising suspicions. Reluctantly, they walked toward the churchyard gate. Though I noticed they positioned themselves where they could watch my every move, alone beside the grave that held a stranger's body. I whispered a prayer to the spirits of my ancestors. Tom was alive, but he was in terrible danger. Our sons had already killed once to cover their tracks, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, but now I had something I hadn't had before: hope. Tom was alive, and together we might still find a way to bring justice to the men who had tried to destroy our family. The question was, could I stay alive long enough to find him? That night, Samuel and Daniel refused to leave me alone. They took turns sitting in our kitchen, claiming they wanted to comfort me in my grief, but their presence felt more like a prison guard's watch than family support. Every time I moved toward the door or reached for my shawl, one of them would ask where I was going, what I needed, whether they could help. You shouldn't be alone right now, Mother, Samuel said when I suggested they return to their own homes. Grief can make a person do dangerous things. The way he said dangerous sent ice through my veins. They were watching me because they suspected I knew something, because they feared what I might do with the knowledge the telegram had given me. But they couldn't watch me forever, and I had to find a way to reach my Uncle Joseph Running Bear. My opportunity came the next morning when Victoria arrived in a flurry of black silk and theatrical tears. Samuel's wife had always been a performer, and she threw herself into the role of grieving daughter-in-law with impressive dedication. Oh, Elizabeth, she wailed, embracing me with arms that felt cold as snake coils. How will we ever survive without dear Papa Tom? He was such a pillar of strength for all of us. Victoria had never called Tom anything but that old man when she thought I couldn't hear, but grief apparently made her generous with posthumous affection. I simply must take you shopping for proper mourning attire, she continued, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. A woman in your position must observe the proprieties. People will be watching to see how the sheriff's widow conducts herself. Samuel nodded approvingly. That's thoughtful of you, Victoria. Mother does need to maintain appearances. I realized this was my chance. That's very kind, but I'm not ready for town yet. Perhaps you could select some fabric for me. I trust your judgment in such matters. Victoria's face lit up with the prospect of spending money, even if it was supposedly mine. Of course, Samuel. You should come with me. We'll need the wagon to carry everything. And I might need help negotiating with the merchants. I don't think Mother should be left alone, Samuel said, but I could see him wavering. Victoria's shopping expeditions were legendary in their scope and expense, and she clearly expected his assistance. Daniel can stay with me, I suggested. I'm just going to rest and perhaps do some mending. Nothing that requires supervision. After some debate, they agreed to the arrangement. Samuel and Victoria departed for town with a long list of morning necessities, leaving Daniel to watch over me. But Daniel had always been the weaker of my two sons, more follower than leader, and I knew how to manage him. I think I'll lie down for a while, I told him, making my voice sound frail and exhausted. This has all been so overwhelming. Of course, Mother, I'll be right here in the kitchen if you need anything. I went to my bedroom and waited, listening to Daniel settle into a chair with one of Tom's old newspapers. Within an hour, I heard the soft sounds of snoring. Daniel had never been able to stay awake during quiet afternoons, a weakness that had frustrated Tom when the boy was supposed to be watching cattle, moving as quietly as a hunting cat. I slipped out through my bedroom window, a skill I'd learned as a girl, sneaking out to meet Tom before we were married. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the same trick now to save our lives. I made my way across the ranch on foot, staying low and using the cover of cottonwoods and sagebrush. The reservation was only 3 miles south, but traveling unseen made the journey twice as long. By the time I reached my uncle's cabin, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Joseph Running Bear was waiting for me on his porch, as if he'd known I was coming. At 65, he was still straight and strong, his long gray hair braided with eagle feathers that marked his status as a war chief. His weathered face showed no surprise at my arrival. "Winona," he said, using my Lakota name. "I have been expecting you since the funeral. The spirits whispered that you would need guidance." "Uncle," I said, using the formal address that showed respect rather than blood kinship. "I need your wisdom. Tom is alive." Joseph's eyes sharpened with interest, but he showed no shock. "I know. The man in the coffin was not your husband. His spirit was not there, and the dead do not lie quiet when they are not truly dead." "How did you know?" "Many things. The way your sons watched you instead of mourning their father. The way the body smelled wrong, too fresh, too clean for a man who died in the wilderness. And this morning, I found tracks." He led me behind his cabin to where the ground was soft from a recent rain. In the mud, I could see the clear impression of horseshoes, but not just any horseshoes. These had a distinctive chip in the left front shoe, a mark I knew as well as my own reflection. "Thunder," I breathed. "Tom's horse. The tracks lead north or toward the Crow Reservation. Your husband rides, but he is wounded. The horse favors his right side, which means the rider cannot sit properly in the saddle." My heart clenched with fear and hope in equal measure. Tom was alive, but he was hurt and hiding in dangerous territory. The Crow had been traditional enemies of the Lakota, though recent treaties had brought uneasy peace. If Tom was seeking refuge there, he must be desperate indeed. "There is more." Joseph continued, leading me to a small leather pouch hanging from his porch rail. "I found this near where the tracks began, caught on a sage bush. It is not Lakota work, nor white man's either." I examined the pouch carefully. It was made of soft deerskin and decorated with beadwork in patterns I didn't recognize. Inside was a small amount of what looked like dried herbs and a piece of paper with writing I couldn't read. "Crow medicine bag," Joseph explained. "Your husband has found help among our old enemies. They are protecting him, healing him. This is why he could send the talking wire message. The Crow have friends among the telegraph workers on the railroad. Can you take me to him?" Joseph's expression grew grave. "Not yet. Your sons have men watching the roads, and they have offered money to anyone who brings word of strangers in the territory. If we move too quickly, we will lead them straight to your husband." "Then what do? We gather proof of their crimes. We find evidence that will convince the white man's law to act. And we prepare for war, because when your sons realize they have failed to kill their father, they will try again, and this time, they will not be so careful about making it look like an accident." As if summoned by his words, we heard horses approaching fast. Joseph grabbed my arm and pulled me inside his cabin, extinguishing the oil lamp and motioning for silence. Through the window, I could see torches moving in the distance, riders searching, calling my name. "Elizabeth," Samuel's voice carried across the prairie. "Mother, where are you? We're worried about you." but the worry in his voice sounded more like anger, and the way the riders spread out in a search pattern looked more like a hunting party than a rescue mission. "They know you are gone," Joseph whispered. "Your younger son has awakened and found you missing. Now they know you are more dangerous than they thought." We crouched in the darkness, listening to the search party grow closer. I realized that my window of freedom had closed. From now on, Samuel and Daniel would watch me like hawks, and any mistake could be my last. But I also knew something they didn't. Tom was alive. He had allies among the Crow, and my uncle Joseph was willing to help me fight back. The odds were still against us. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might have a chance. The question was whether we could gather enough evidence to destroy my sons before they destroyed us. We crouched in Joseph's darkened cabin, listening to the search party grow closer. The torchlight flickered through the windows like fireflies, and I could hear Samuel's voice growing more frustrated with each passing minute. "She can't have gone far on foot," he was saying to someone. "Check every cabin, every root cellar, every place an old woman might hide. An old woman." The contempt in his voice cut deeper than any knife. To my own son, I had become nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated, no different from a rabid dog or a lame horse. Joseph pressed something into my hand, a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "Evidence," he whispered. "I have been gathering it since your husband first came to me with suspicions. Hide this well. When the time comes, it will speak louder than any witness." The search party passed by Joseph's cabin without stopping. To them, he was just another old Indian kept beneath their notice and unworthy of suspicion. Their arrogance would be their downfall. After the torches disappeared into the distance, Joseph lit a single candle and spread the contents of the bundle on his wooden table. What I saw there made my blood run cold. Bank drafts signed in Tom's name, but written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Receipts for supplies that had never been delivered to our ranch. Most damning of all, a contract signed by Samuel and Daniel, selling our ranch to the Wyoming Central Railroad for a sum that would make them wealthy men if Tom and I were both dead. "How did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your husband was not the only one with suspicions. Chen Wei has been watching, listening, keeping records. The banker's wife cleans house for Doc Hayes and sees things she is not supposed to see. Even some of the railroad men have grown uncomfortable with your son's methods." Joseph unfolded a piece of paper covered with careful handwriting in English and Lakota symbols. "Testimonies," he explained. "People who have seen things, heard things, but were too afraid to speak, until now." I read the testimonies with growing horror and amazement. Jake Morrison, the cowhand who'd been beaten for refusing to poison our well, had recovered enough to give a detailed account of Samuel and Daniel's threats. Mrs. Patterson had seen them meeting with strange men in expensive suits, counting out gold coins in the back room of the hotel. Even young Marcus Webb had found the courage to admit he'd been forced to send false telegrams under threat of violence. But the most shocking testimony came from Dr. Patterson himself, the cold-eyed man who'd claimed to examine Tom's body. According to his signed statement, Samuel and Daniel had paid him $500 to identify a stranger's corpse as their father. No questions asked. "The body in the coffin," I said, my voice shaking. Who was it really? Joseph's expression grew grim. "A drifter named William Hayes. No family, no friends, nobody to ask questions when he disappeared. Your sons killed him just to have a body to bury." The casual cruelty of it staggered me. They had murdered an innocent man simply to make their lie more convincing. How had I raised children capable of such monstrous acts? There is more. Joseph continued, pulling out a final document. "This came from the Crow Reservation yesterday, carried by a rider who knows the old trails. It was a letter in Tom's handwriting. Though shakier than usual, my beloved Beth, I am alive but badly hurt. Samuel and Daniel ambushed me on the trail to Fort Laramie, shot me, and left me for dead in a ravine. Thunder carried me to safety, but I lost much blood. The Crow found me and have been healing me with their medicine. I am getting stronger each day, but I cannot return until we have proof of what our sons have done. Trust Joseph, trust the Crow, and trust that my love for you burns stronger than their hatred. We will have justice." Tom, tears ran down my cheeks as I read his words. He was alive, he was healing, and he still loved me despite the horror our family had become. But he was also trapped, unable to return without proof that would convince the territorial authorities. "We have the proof," I said, gesturing to the documents spread across Joseph's table. "Bank fraud, murder, conspiracy, Enough to hang them both. Yes. But we must get this evidence to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, and we must do it without your sons knowing, or they will kill everyone who has spoken against them. Before I could respond, we heard horses approaching again, but this time, only 2 riders, moving slowly and quietly. Joseph blew out the candle and we peered through the window. Samuel and Daniel sat their horses just outside the cabin, no longer pretending to search. They knew exactly where I was. "Mother," Samuel called out, his voice carrying a false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and we can discuss this like a family." "Like a family," Daniel echoed, though his voice shook with nervousness. Joseph's hand moved to the war axe hanging from his belt. At 65. He was still a formidable warrior, but even he couldn't fight 2 armed men in their prime. "Elizabeth," Samuel continued, "we found some very interesting things when we searched your bedroom. Letters, documents, evidence of, shall we say, mental instability, Doctor. Patterson is prepared to testify that grief has affected your mind, that you've been having delusions about Pa still being alive." My blood turned to ice. They were going to have me declared insane, lock me away where I couldn't expose their crimes. It was a perfect solution from their perspective, no messy murder to cover up, just a grieving widow who'd lost her mind. "We've also discovered that you've been stealing from the ranch accounts," Daniel added, finding his voice. "Forging Pa's signature, taking money that doesn't belong to you. Very sad, really. The stress of widowhood can make people do terrible things. They had thought of everything. Bank fraud to explain away the money they'd stolen, mental illness to discredit anything I might say, and a network of bought witnesses to support their lies. If I walked out of this cabin, I would disappear into some asylum, and Tom would never know what had happened to me. But Joseph Running Bear had not lived through 65 years of frontier warfare by surrendering when the odds were against him. "There is another way," he whispered to me in Lakota. "The old way. The way of our people when white man's law fails." I understood what he meant. If we couldn't get justice through territorial courts, we would have to take it ourselves. It was dangerous, probably fatal, but it might be our only chance to save Tom and expose the truth. "Mother," Samuel called again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Come out now, or we'll come in and get you. Either way, you're coming with us tonight." The threat was clear. This was my last chance to choose how this story would end, as a victim or as a warrior. I made my choice. The silence stretched between us like a drawn bowstring. Outside, Samuel and Daniel waited with the patience of predators who knew their prey was trapped. Inside, Joseph and I faced the choice that would determine not just our survival, but whether justice would ever come to Wyoming Territory. "The old way," I whispered back to Joseph in Lakota, feeling something ancient and fierce awakening in my chest. My grandmother's blood, the blood of warriors who had never bowed to any enemy, began to sing in my veins. Joseph's weathered face split into a grim smile. "Winona, granddaughter of Standing Bear, daughter of warriors. I have been waiting your whole life to see this woman emerge." He moved with the silent grace of a hunting cat, gathering the evidence into a waterproof pouch and securing it inside a hidden compartment built into his cabin wall. "This will be safe until Tom returns," he said. "But first, we must survive the night. Mother." Samuel's voice had lost all pretense of patience. "I'm counting to 10. If you don't come out, we're coming in, and I won't be responsible for what happens to that old Indian." The threat against Joseph ignited something primal in me. These men who called themselves my sons were threatening to harm the elder who had guided me through every important moment of my life. They had already murdered their father and an innocent drifter. Now they wanted to destroy the last person on earth who truly understood both sides of my heritage. 5. Samuel continued counting. Joseph handed me his spare rifle, an old but well-maintained Winchester that had seen action in a dozen frontier conflicts. "Can you still shoot like your father taught you?" I checked the weapon with movements that came back as naturally as breathing. My father had insisted I learn to defend myself, saying that frontier women who couldn't shoot were frontier widows waiting to happen. I'd been one of the best shots in the territory before marriage, and motherhood had softened my hands. 8. "There is a back way out," Joseph whispered. "Through the root cellar. It leads to the creek bed, where you can follow the water to the old trading post. From there, You can reach the Crow Reservation by dawn. What about you? Joseph's eyes held the calm acceptance of a man who had faced death many times. I am 65 years old. Winona, I have lived to see my people forced onto reservations, our buffalo slaughtered, our children sent to white schools to forget our ways. If I die tonight fighting the sons who betrayed their own father, it will be a good death, a warrior's death. 10. The cabin door exploded inward as Samuel and Daniel burst through with guns drawn, but we were no longer there. Joseph had triggered a hidden mechanism that dropped us through the floor into the root cellar he dug during the Indian Wars, a refuge that had saved his life more than once when cavalry patrols came hunting. Above us, we could hear them ransacking the cabin, cursing and shouting as they realized we'd escaped. The old bastards got hidey holes, Daniel snarled. Find them. Joseph led me through a tunnel that connected to the creek bed 50 yards from his cabin. The underground passage was barely wide enough for one person, carved from earth and stone by a man who understood that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. We emerged near the water, hidden by overhanging willows. In the distance, I could see torchlight moving through Joseph's cabin as my sons searched for evidence of where we'd gone. They will find the tunnel soon, Joseph said. We must separate. You go to the Crow Reservation. Tell them Joseph Running Bear sends his niece to seek justice in the old way. They will understand. I won't leave you to face them alone. You will. Because that is what warriors do. We sacrifice ourselves so that justice can survive. Joseph gripped my shoulders with hands that had held weapons, raised children, and buried too many friends. Your husband needs you alive. The territory needs the truth you carry. I am one old man, but you are the bridge between worlds. Go. Before I could argue further, he melted back into the shadows with the silence of a ghost. Joseph Running Bear was going to make his last stand, buying me time with his life. I followed the creek bed north, moving through water that would hide my scent from any tracking dogs they might bring. The October night was cold, and my wet skirts quickly became heavy as iron, but I pushed forward with the determination of a woman who had finally remembered what she truly was. Behind me, I heard gunshots, 3 quick reports followed by a longer silence. My heart clenched with grief and rage. Joseph had kept his word. He had died a warrior's death, taking at least one of my sons with him. But which one, and would the survivor come after me with reinforcements? Or would he flee to avoid questions about why he'd been shooting at peaceful Indians in the middle of the night? I reached the old trading post as dawn painted the eastern sky the color of fresh blood. The abandoned building had been a neutral meeting ground during the Indian Wars, where white traders and tribal representatives had negotiated under flags of truce. Now it would serve as my refuge while I planned the next phase of this war. Inside the crumbling structure, I found evidence that someone else had been using it recently, a bedroll, supplies, and most importantly, a cache of weapons hidden beneath loose floorboards. Someone had been preparing for conflict, and I suspected I knew who. A shadow fell across the doorway, and I spun with Joseph's rifle raised, ready to fight to the death. Easy. Beth, said a familiar voice. It's me. Tom stepped into the trading post, moving slowly but under his own power. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face bore the pallor of a man who'd lost too much blood. But his eyes burned with the same fierce determination I remembered from our courting days. My God, I whispered on not lowering the rifle. You're really alive. Alive and ready to finish what our sons started. Tom's voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. I heard the gunshots from Joseph's place. Is he dead? He died so I could escape, so I could bring you this. I pulled the evidence pouch from my coat, my hands shaking with exhaustion and grief. Tom examined the documents with the methodical attention of a lawman building a case. When he finished, his expression was carved from stone. Murder, fraud, conspiracy, and now they've killed Joseph too. He looked up at me with eyes that held no trace of the gentle rancher I'd married. Beth, I want you to ride to Fort Laramie and bring back the territorial marshal. This ends today, one way or another. What are you going to do? What I should have done the moment I suspected them. I'm going to arrest my own sons for murder. The war was about to reach its final battle, and I realized that win or lose, our family would never exist again. The boys I'd raised with such love were already dead, replaced by killers who wore their faces. All that remained was to see that justice was served, no matter the cost. Tom's plan was as methodical as everything else he'd ever done as sheriff, but it carried the cold precision of a man who'd been betrayed by his own blood. As dawn light strengthened over the Wyoming plains, He spread a hand-drawn map across the trading post's dusty floor, marking positions like a general preparing for battle. Samuel will be at our ranch, trying to establish an alibi for Joseph's murder, Tom said. His voice steady despite the pain I could see in his eyes. Daniel's probably with him, unless... He paused, studying my face. How many gunshots did you hear? 3, then silence. Joseph was a warrior. He wouldn't have gone down without taking at least one of them with him. Tom's jaw tightened. We'll know soon enough which son I'll be arresting and which one I'll be burying. The casual way he spoke of burying his own child sent a chill through me. But I understood. The boys we'd raised were already dead, killed by their own greed and cruelty. What remained were murderers who happened to share our blood. Beth, I need you to ride to Doc Hayes first. Tell her to gather the town council, Chen Wei, Reverend Matthews, the banker. Anyone with influence. They need to hear the truth before Samuel can spread more lies about your mental state. I nodded, checking the loads in Joseph's rifle. What about the territorial marshal? I'll handle that myself. There's a telegraph station at the Crow Reservation. They installed it last year as part of the new treaty arrangements. I can wire Cheyenne directly and request immediate assistance. Tom's expression grew grim. But even if the marshal rides hard, he won't be here until tomorrow evening. We need to keep Samuel and Daniel contained until then. Contained how, if one of them killed Joseph, the survivor will be desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. Tom pulled his sheriff's badge from his shirt pocket, the silver star catching the morning light. It was tarnished and dented from 20 years of frontier service, but it still carried the full authority of territorial law. I'm still the sheriff of this county, Beth, and I have evidence of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. That gives me the right to make arrests, even if the criminals are my own sons. The weight of what he was proposing settled over us both. Tom was going to arrest his own children for murdering him, an irony so bitter it almost defied comprehension. You can't face them alone, I said. Samuel's always been quick with a gun, and if Daniel's still alive, they'll fight rather than surrender. I won't be alone. The Crow have agreed to help. They owe me for protecting their water rights during the railroad negotiations. And there are others in town who've grown suspicious of Samuel and Daniel's sudden wealth. Tom was right about that. In a small frontier community, unexplained prosperity was like blood in the water. Everyone noticed, and most people talked. Our sons had been too arrogant to hide their newfound wealth, too confident that their parents' deaths would silence any questions. I rode back toward Clearwater Township as the sun climbed higher, my mind racing with everything that needed to happen in the next few hours. The evidence had to reach the right people. The community had to understand the truth, and somehow we had to prevent Samuel and Daniel from escaping or killing more innocent people. The town was already stirring when I reached Doc Hayes' clinic. Margaret was tending to a cowboy's broken arm, but she took one look at my face and sent her patient away with orders to return later. Elizabeth, dear God, we thought you were dead. Samuel came through town before dawn, claiming you'd been killed in an Indian raid. He said Joseph Running Bear had gone mad with grief over the new reservation boundaries and, she stopped, studying my expression more carefully. That's not what happened, is it? No, Margaret. And I need you to gather the town council immediately. There are things you need to know about Samuel and Daniel Thimizumwash. Things that will shock you to your core. Within an hour, the most influential members of Clearwater Township had assembled in the back room of Chen Wei's store. The banker, the reverend, the school teacher, the hotel owner, people who'd known our family for decades and trusted our reputation. I told them everything. The evidence Joseph had gathered. Tom's narrow escape from murder. The innocent drifter killed to provide a body for the fake funeral. The conspiracy with the railroad men. And finally, Joseph Running Bear's heroic death trying to protect me from my own sons. The silence that followed was deafening. These were frontier people, accustomed to violence and betrayal, but the idea that children would murder their own parents for money was almost beyond their ability to process. You're certain about this? Reverend Matthews asked, his face pale with shock. You're absolutely certain that Samuel and Daniel killed Tom and that poor drifter? I spread Joseph's evidence across Chen Wei's counter, the forged bank documents, the signed testimonies, the railroad contract, Tom's letter describing the ambush. The proof was overwhelming and undeniable. Sweet Jesus, the banker whispered, recognizing his own institution's letterhead on the fraudulent documents. They've been forging signatures for months. I should have caught this. Should have questioned why Tom was suddenly making such large withdrawals. They're very clever, Chen Wei said grimly. They planned this for a long time. Bought the right people. Threatened others into silence. If not for Joseph Running Bear's wisdom and Tom's survival, they would have succeeded completely. Where are they now? The hotel owner asked. Samuel's at our ranch, probably destroying evidence and preparing to flee. Daniel. I paused, remembering the gunshots. Daniel may be dead. Joseph Running Bear didn't die easily. As if summoned by our conversation, we heard horses approaching fast. Through the store window, I could see Samuel riding hard down Main Street, his face a mask of fury and desperation. He was alone. Daniel's dead, I said with certainty, and Samuel knows his time is running out. Samuel reined in his horse directly in front of Chen Wei's store, as if he somehow knew we were inside. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like gunpowder burns. He looked like a man who'd been through hell and was ready to take others with him. Mother, he shouted, his voice carrying across the street. I know you're in there. Come out now. And maybe some of these good people won't have to get hurt. The threat was clear. Samuel had nothing left to lose, and he was prepared to turn our peaceful town into a battlefield rather than face justice for his crimes. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He thought he was facing a grieving widow and a handful of frightened shopkeepers. He didn't know that Tom was alive, that the territorial marshal was coming, and that the entire community now knew the truth about what he'd done. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time since this nightmare started, Samuel was the one who didn't know what was coming for him. Samuel sat his horse in the middle of Main Street like a man possessed, his Colt .45 drawn and pointed at Chen Wei's store. Blood stained his shirt from wounds that looked like they came from Joseph Running Bear's war axe, and his eyes held the wild desperation of a cornered animal. I know you're all in there, he shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and rage. My mother, the good doctor, the reverend. All of you listening to lies about me and my brother. Daniel's dead because of those lies. Killed by that savage Joseph Running Bear through the store window. I could see people on the street stopping to stare. Word was spreading quickly through town that something was happening, that the sheriff's son had gone mad with grief and was threatening innocent people. Samuel, Reverend Matthews called out, stepping toward the door despite Chen Wei's attempts to hold him back. Son, put down that gun. We can talk about this like civilized people. Civilized. Samuel's laugh was harsh and bitter. There's nothing civilized about what happened to my family. Reverend, my father's dead, my brother's dead, and now my own mother has lost her mind with grief. She's been telling terrible stories, accusing me and Daniel of things no son would ever do. The performance was masterful, I had to admit, to anyone who didn't know the truth. Samuel looked like a grieving son driven to desperation by his mother's madness. His voice carried just the right note of anguish. His posture suggested a man barely holding himself together. But I could see through the mask. This was the same cold calculation he'd shown when planning our murders. The same manipulative skill he'd used to fool us for months. Even now, with his back against the wall and his brother's blood on his hands, Samuel was still trying to control the narrative. Mrs. Clearwater, he continued, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Mother, please come out and talk to me. You're sick. You need help. But I can't get you the care you need if you keep hiding from me. Chen Wei moved closer to the window, studying Samuel's position. He's positioned himself where he can see both the front and back doors, he whispered. If we try to leave, he'll have a clear shot. How long can he keep this up? Doc Hayes asked. He's wounded, exhausted, and his horse is about to collapse. Time is on our side. But I wasn't so sure. Samuel had always been cunning, and even in desperation when he was thinking several moves ahead. This public display wasn't just about threatening us, it was about establishing his version of events before anyone could contradict him. He's creating witnesses, I realized aloud. People who will remember seeing a grieving son trying to help his mentally ill mother when the territorial marshal arrives. Samuel wants dozens of townspeople ready to testify that I was the one acting irrationally. The banker nodded grimly. And if he can provoke us into shooting first, he becomes the victim instead of the aggressor. Very clever for a desperate man. Mother, Samuel called again, his voice rising with manufactured anguish. I know you're frightened. I know the grief has confused you, but I'm still your son. I still love you, despite everything you've said about me. Come out. and we'll go home together. We'll get through this as a family." The words hit me like physical blows. This was the voice he'd used as a child when he wanted something. The same tone he'd employed when apologizing for childhood mischief. For a moment, I almost believed him myself. Almost forgot about the evidence in Joseph's pouch and the cold calculation in his eyes. That was Samuel's greatest weapon, not his gun, but his ability to make people doubt what they knew to be true. But then I heard something that changed everything, the sound of horses approaching from the north. Moving fast and purposeful. Through the back window of Chen Wei's store, I could see a group of riders cresting the hill that overlooked our town. Tom rode in the lead, his sheriff's badge catching the morning sunlight. Behind him came 6 Crow warriors in full regalia, their faces painted for battle, their weapons ready. Bringing up the rear was a man I didn't recognize but whose bearings screamed military authority, probably the territorial marshal Tom had summoned. Samuel was so focused on the store and his performance for the growing crowd that he didn't notice the approaching riders until they were almost on top of him. When he finally turned and saw his supposedly dead father riding toward him with a war party of Crow allies, the blood drained from his face like water from a broken bucket. "Hello, Samuel," Tom said, his voice carrying across Main Street with the authority of 20 years as sheriff. "You look surprised to see me. I suppose you thought that ambush on the Fort Laramie trail had finished the job." Samuel's gun wavered in his hand as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Pa, but you're dead. We buried you. I saw your body." "You saw William Hayes's body. You mean the drifter you and Daniel murdered to cover your tracks." Tom's voice was cold as winter wind. "Just like you murdered Joseph Running Bear last night when he tried to protect your mother from your lies." The crowd that had gathered to watch Samuel's performance was murmuring with shock and confusion. People who had attended Tom's funeral 3 days ago were seeing him alive and accusing his own son of murder. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to process. "You're lying," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're dead. I watched them put you in the ground." "Samuel Clearwater," Tom said formally, dismounting from his horse with careful movements that favored his wounded side. "By the authority vested in me as sheriff of this county, I arrest you for the murders of William Hayes and Joseph Running Bear, for conspiracy to commit murder, for fraud, and for attempted murder of a peace officer." The Crow warriors had spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape route. The territorial marshal, a hard-faced man with steel-gray hair, kept his hand near his weapon but let Tom handle the arrest. Samuel looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully constructed web of lies was collapsing around him. The crowd that had been sympathetic to his grief was now staring at him with horror and disgust. His own father, supposedly dead and buried, was standing in the street with evidence of his crimes. "I won't go to prison," Samuel said finally, raising his gun toward Tom. "I won't hang for killing people who deserve to die." But before he could pull the trigger, a rifle shot rang out from Chen Wei's store. Samuel jerked in his saddle, then toppled to the ground, his weapon falling harmlessly in the dust. I lowered Joseph Running Bear's Winchester and stepped out of the store, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I'd just done. I had shot my own son to save my husband's life, and I felt no regret, only a deep, weary sadness for the children we'd lost long before this day. "It's over," Tom said quietly, kneeling beside Samuel's still form. Finally, it's over. Justice had come to Wyoming Territory, but the price had been higher than any family should ever have to pay. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed to stretch across all of Wyoming Territory. Samuel lay motionless in the dust of Main Street, his blood seeping into the same earth where he'd played as a child, where Tom had taught him to ride, where we'd once been a family. Marshal Harrison dismounted and knelt beside Samuel's body, checking for signs of life with the professional detachment of a man who'd seen too much frontier violence. After a moment, he stood and removed his hat in a gesture of respect for the dead, regardless of their crimes. "Samuel Clearwater is deceased," he announced formally to the crowd that had gathered, "shot while attempting to murder a peace officer during the execution of a lawful arrest." Tom approached me slowly, his weathered face etched with a pain that went deeper than his physical wounds. "Beth," he said softly, "I'm sorry you had to be the one to, No," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the tears on my cheeks. "I'm not sorry. He would have killed you, and probably half the people in this town before he was done. The boy we raised died long before I pulled that trigger." Marshal Harrison stepped forward, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen the worst of human nature without losing their sense of justice. "Mrs. Clearwater, I'm Marshal William Harrison from the territorial capital. Sheriff Clearwater sent word about a conspiracy involving murder and railroad fraud. I'll need to take formal statements from everyone involved over the next several hours." The full scope of Samuel and Daniel's crimes was laid out in official testimony. Chen Wei produced the forged bank documents. Doc Hayes testified about the false death certificate and the murdered drifter. Marcus Webb, trembling with relief at finally being able to tell the truth, described the threatening telegrams he'd been forced to send. The Crow warriors who had helped Tom also gave testimony through an interpreter, describing how they'd found him wounded and near death in a ravine, how they'd nursed him back to health using traditional medicine, and how he'd convinced them to help him seek justice through white man's law rather than taking revenge in the old way. "The evidence is overwhelming," Marshal Harrison said after reviewing all the documents and testimonies. Samuel and Daniel Clearwater murdered William Hayes to fake their father's death, attempted to murder Sheriff Clearwater for his insurance money and land rights, killed Joseph Running Bear to cover their tracks, and defrauded multiple financial institutions. This is one of the most comprehensive criminal conspiracies I've encountered in 20 years of territorial law enforcement. "What happens now?" Reverend Matthews asked. "Now we clean up the mess they left behind," the marshal replied grimly. "The railroad contracts they signed are void. They had no legal right to sell land they didn't own. The insurance companies will investigate the fraudulent claims, and the community will need to decide how to move forward." As the official proceedings continued, I found myself standing beside the window of Chen Wei's store, looking out at the place where my son had died. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only a dark stain in the dirt to mark where a family had destroyed itself through greed and betrayal. "Elizabeth," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Chief Running Wolf of the Crow Nation, a dignified man in his 60s who had ridden with Tom's rescue party. "Your uncle Joseph Running Bear was a great warrior and a wise man. His death will be remembered with honor among both our peoples." "Thank you," I said, grateful for his words. "He died protecting the truth. I think that's how he would have wanted it." There is something else," Chief Running Wolf continued, pulling a small bundle from his coat. "Before he died, Joseph Running Bear asked us to give you this if he did not survive the battle." I unwrapped the bundle with trembling hands. Inside was Joseph's war axe, the same weapon that had killed Daniel and wounded Samuel before Joseph himself fell. Wrapped around the handle was a piece of paper with words written in both English and Lakota. "For Winona, daughter of two worlds, warrior of both peoples. May you use this wisdom to build bridges where others would burn them. The old ways and the new ways must learn to dance together, or both will die. Your uncle who loved you, Joseph Running Bear." Tears ran down my cheeks as I read his final message. Even in death, Joseph was teaching me, reminding me that my mixed heritage wasn't a burden to bear but a gift to share. Marshal Harrison approached with Tom, both men looking exhausted but satisfied. "The territorial governor will want a full report on this case," the marshal said. "It's going to be studied in law schools for years to come, a perfect example of how greed can corrupt even the strongest family bonds." "What about the ranch?" Tom asked. "Samuel and Daniel mortgaged it heavily to finance their schemes. We may lose everything." "Actually," Chen Wei interrupted, approaching with a ledger book, "you may not lose as much as you think. I've been going through the financial records, and most of the money they borrowed was obtained through fraud. The courts will likely void those debts along with everything else." It was a small comfort, but a real one. Tom and I might be able to keep the home we'd built together, the land where we'd raised our children and buried our dreams. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky the color of fresh hope, I realized that while our family was gone forever, something new might still be possible. Tom and I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and we'd done it by combining the wisdom of two cultures, his Anglo sense of law and justice, my Lakota understanding of spiritual warfare. "What do we do now?" I asked Tom as we prepared to return to our ranch, to the home that would never be the same but might still offer peace. "We heal," he said simply. "We remember the boys they used to be instead of the men they became. We honor Joseph's memory by building the kind of community he believed in, and we make sure this story gets told, so that other families might recognize the warning signs before it's too late." Marshal Harrison mounted his horse, preparing to return to Cheyenne with his report. "Mrs. Clearwater," he said, tipping his hat, "what you did today took more courage than most men show in a lifetime. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude. As the marshal rode away and the Crow warriors began their journey home, I stood with Tom in the gathering dusk, surrounded by neighbors who had become family and holding the war axe of an uncle who had died for truth. The war was over. Justice had been served. But the real work, the work of healing and rebuilding, was just beginning. The ride back to our ranch felt like traveling through a graveyard of memories. Every familiar landmark, the old oak where Tom had first kissed me, the creek where our boys had learned to fish, the meadow where we'd held family picnics on summer Sundays, now carried the weight of betrayal and loss. Tom rode beside me in silence, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. The wounds from Samuel and Daniel's ambush were healing, but slowly. And I could see that every movement cost him dearly. Still, he sat straight in the saddle with the dignity of a man who'd faced the worst life could offer and survived. As we crested the hill that overlooked our home, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The ranch house sat exactly as we'd left it 3 days ago, but it looked different somehow. Smaller, more fragile, like a child's toy that had been left out in the rain. "It's still our home, Beth," Tom said quietly, reading my thoughts. "Whatever happened here, whatever they did, this land remembers the good years too. 26 years of love and honest work don't disappear because of a few months of madness." I wanted to believe him, but as we approached the house, I could see evidence of Samuel and Daniel's presence everywhere. Empty whiskey bottles on the porch, muddy boot prints across the clean floors I'd scrubbed just last week, papers scattered where they'd searched for evidence to destroy. Inside, the damage was worse. They'd ransacked Tom's desk looking for the insurance policies, torn apart my sewing basket searching for hidden money, even dumped out the flour and sugar canisters in case we'd hidden documents there. The kitchen table where we'd shared our last breakfast together was scarred with knife marks where someone had carved in frustration. "Animals," Tom muttered, surveying the destruction. "They treated our home like it was enemy territory to be conquered." Always. But it was the parlor that broke my heart completely. The room where we'd laid Tom's supposed body for the funeral had been stripped of everything valuable: my grandmother's silver candlesticks, Tom's grandfather's pocket watch, even the family Bible with our marriage certificate pressed between its pages. "They stole everything," I whispered, Nas sinking into the one chair they'd left behind. "Not just our money, not just our lives, but our memories too." Tom knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his calloused palms. "No, Beth, memories can't be stolen. Only treasures can. And the real treasures, the love we shared, the good we did in this community, the bridges we built between your people and mine, those are still here." Before I could respond, we heard horses approaching. My first instinct was fear. Had some of Samuel and Daniel's railroad conspirators come to finish what they'd started? But when I looked through the window, I saw something that made my heart swell with unexpected warmth. A wagon train was coming up our lane, led by Chen Wei and Doc Hayes. Behind them came the Crow warriors who had helped rescue Tom, followed by families from both the Anglo and Lakota communities. They carried tools, supplies, and food, enough to rebuild not just our house, but our faith in human goodness. "Surprise work party," Doc Hayes announced as she climbed down from her wagon. "We figured you two might need some help putting things back together." Chen Wei began unloading lumber and nails. "Cannot let good neighbors suffer because of bad sons," he said in his careful English. "Community is family too." Chief Running Wolf approached with his arms full of blankets and preserved meat. "Joseph Running Bear spoke often of this place," he said solemnly. "He said it was where two worlds learned to live in peace. We will not let his vision die with him." Over the next several hours, our home was transformed. The Anglo family scrubbed and swept, removing all traces of Samuel and Daniel's destructive presence. The Lakota women prepared a feast using traditional recipes, filling our kitchen with the scents of sage and sweetgrass. The Crow warriors repaired the damage to our furniture with the patient skill of men who understood that some things were worth preserving. But it was the children who brought the most healing: Anglo, Lakota, and mixed-blood children like I had been, playing together in our yard while their parents worked, their laughter echoing across the plains like a promise that the future might be brighter than the past. Young Mary Patterson, the banker's daughter, approached me shyly as I watched from the porch. "Mrs. Clearwater," she said, "my mama told me what happened with your boys. I'm real sorry they turned out bad, but I want you to know that lots of us kids think you and Sheriff Clearwater are the best grown-ups in the territory." Her simple words hit me harder than all the formal condolences I'd received. This child, barely 10 years old, understood something that Samuel and Daniel had forgotten, that worth wasn't measured in gold or land, but in the love and respect you earned from your community. As the sun began to set, painting our rebuilt home in shades of gold and crimson, I realized that something miraculous had happened. Our house was cleaner than it had been in months. Our pantry was fuller than it had been in years, and our hearts, though still wounded, were no longer empty. "Thank you," I said to the assembled crowd, my voice thick with emotion. "All of you. You've given us more than just a clean house. You've given us hope." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "Elizabeth, Tom, we want you to know that what happened with Samuel and Daniel doesn't change how this community feels about your family. You've been pillars of this town for over 2 decades. That kind of goodness doesn't get erased by the evil actions of others." Chief Running Wolf nodded gravely. "Joseph Running Bear always said that when one branch of a tree grows crooked, you don't cut down the whole tree. You prune the bad branch and let the rest grow strong." As our neighbors began to depart, promising to return soon for visits and help with the ranch work, Tom and I stood together on our porch, watching the last wagon disappear into the twilight. "Do you think we can really do this?" I asked him. "Start over. Build something new from what's left." Tom wrapped his good arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "Beth, we've survived the worst betrayal any parents could face, and we're still standing. We still have each other. We still have this land. And we still have a community that believes in us. If that's not enough to build a new life on, I don't know what would be." I leaned into his warmth, feeling truly safe for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new sorrows to process, new decisions to make. But tonight, we were home, we were together, and we were surrounded by the love of people who had chosen to see us as family. The war was over. The healing had begun. 3 weeks after the community work party, I stood in what had once been Samuel's bedroom, now transformed into something entirely different. The walls that had once displayed his childhood drawings and school certificates now held maps of the territory, lists of families in need, and correspondence with territorial officials about establishing what Tom and I had decided to call the Running Bear Community Center. "Are you certain about this, Beth?" Tom asked from the doorway, his arm finally free from the sling, but still moving carefully. "Converting the boys' rooms into meeting spaces, turning our home into a community center. It's a big change." I looked around the room that would soon host meetings between Anglo settlers and tribal representatives, where children of all backgrounds would learn to read and write together, where disputes could be settled through discussion rather than violence. Joseph Running Bear died believing that 2 worlds could learn to dance together instead of fighting. If we don't honor that belief with action, his death means nothing. The idea had come to me during one of the sleepless nights that still plagued me. I would lie awake thinking about Samuel and Daniel, wondering where we'd gone wrong as parents, when suddenly I'd hear Joseph's voice in my memory. "The old ways and the new ways must learn to dance together, or both will die." That's when I understood what our new purpose had to be. We couldn't bring back our sons or undo the pain they'd caused, but we could make sure that other families, other children, had better examples to follow. "The territorial governor's letter came yesterday," Tom said, pulling an official envelope from his shirt pocket. "He's approved our request to establish the center as an official mediation point between the territorial government and the tribal nations. We'll have funding for a school teacher, supplies, and even a small stipend for our work as coordinators." It was more than we dared hope for. The governor had been impressed by Marshall Harrison's report about how our multicultural community had come together to solve the crisis, and he wanted to use Clearwater Township as a model for other frontier settlements. "There's something else," Tom continued, his voice taking on a tone I recognized from his sheriff days. "Chief Running Wolf sent word that the tribal council wants to make you an honorary member of the Crow Nation, in recognition of your role in bridging our peoples. It's an unprecedented honor." Beth. I felt tears prick my eyes. After losing my sons and my Uncle Joseph, the idea of being formally welcomed into another family, one bound by choice rather than blood, touched me more deeply than I could express. A knock at the front door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Doc Hayes approaching with a young woman I didn't recognize, someone in her 20s with the mixed features that marked her as part Native American, part Anglo. "Elizabeth, Tom," Doc Hayes said as I opened the door. "I'd like you to meet Sarah Crowfeather. She's just arrived from the territorial capital. and she has a very interesting story to tell. Sarah Crowfeather was a striking woman with intelligent dark eyes and the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to navigate both worlds from birth. Her dress was a careful blend of Anglo and native styles, practical but beautiful, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd never apologized for her heritage. "Mrs. Clearwater," she said, extending her hand in the Anglo fashion while also offering the traditional Lakota greeting. "I've heard about your work here, about what you and your husband are trying to build. I'd like to help." "What kind of help?" Tom asked, inviting her inside. "I'm a teacher," Sarah explained, settling into one of our kitchen chairs. "Trained at the Territorial College, but also educated in traditional ways by my grandmother. I've been looking for a place where I could teach children to value both their heritages instead of choosing between them." It was exactly what we needed. Someone young enough to connect with the children, educated enough to meet territorial standards, and wise enough to honor the old ways alongside the new. "The position doesn't pay much," I warned her, "and the work won't be easy. There are still people in this territory who don't believe the races should mix, much less learn together." Sarah's smile was fierce and determined. "Mrs. Clearwater, I've spent my whole life proving that mixed blood doesn't mean mixed up. I know exactly what I'm getting into, and I want to be part of what you're building here." Over the next several hours, we discussed our vision for the Running Bear Community Center. It would be part school, part meeting hall, part mediation center. Children would learn reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside traditional crafts, storytelling, and the history of both peoples. Adults would gather to resolve disputes, plan community projects, and celebrate the festivals of all cultures represented in our territory. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as the afternoon wore on. "I have a letter from my cousin in the territorial capital. He works in the land office, and he wanted me to tell you that all the fraudulent contracts Samuel and Daniel signed have been officially voided. Your ranch is completely free and clear, and the railroad company has been fined heavily for their role in the conspiracy." The relief I felt was overwhelming. Tom and I had been living with the fear that we might still lose our home to creditors or conspirators, but now we knew for certain that the land we'd worked so hard to build would remain ours. "More than that," Sarah continued, "the territorial government is so impressed with how your community handled this crisis that they're considering making Clearwater Township the official model for frontier integration. There's talk of bringing delegations here from other territories to learn from your example." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming plains, painting our home in the golden light that had always meant peace to me, I realized that something miraculous had happened. From the ashes of our family's destruction, something beautiful and lasting was being born. "Joseph would be proud," Tom said quietly, standing beside me on the porch as Sarah and Doc Hayes prepared to leave. "He always believed this land could be a place where different peoples learned to live as one family." Shaman Shof. I touched the war axe hanging from my belt, Joseph's final gift, now a symbol of the warrior spirit that would be needed to build this new world. "We'll make mistakes," I said. "There will be setbacks, people who resist change, children who don't understand why the old hatreds need to die. But we'll keep trying," Tom replied, taking my hand in his, "because the alternative, the hatred and greed that destroyed our sons, is too terrible to accept." As night fell over the territory, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Samuel and Daniel's betrayal, genuine hope for the future. We had lost our children, but we had gained a larger family. We had lost our innocence, but we had gained wisdom. And we had lost our old life, but we had found a new purpose that would outlast any single family's tragedy. The foundation of tomorrow was being built on the ashes of yesterday, and it would be stronger than anything we'd lost. 6 months after the Running Bear Community Center opened its doors, I stood before the largest gathering our territory had ever seen. Representatives from 3 tribal nations sat alongside territorial officials, while families of every background filled the chairs we'd arranged in what had once been our front pasture. The occasion was the official dedication of the center, but it felt more like a celebration of everything we'd learned about healing and hope. "When I was a young woman," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "my Lakota grandmother told me that some seeds only grow after they've been through fire. At the time, I thought she was talking about the prairie grass that springs up after a wildfire. Now I understand she was talking about people." Governor Richards, a dignified man who traveled from Cheyenne specifically for this ceremony, nodded approvingly from his seat in the front row. Beside him sat Chief Running Wolf and Chief Standing Bear, their presence a testament to the trust that had been built between our peoples. 6 months ago, this community faced a crisis that could have destroyed everything we'd worked to build, a family betrayal so complete, so devastating, that it shook the foundation of everything we believed about love, loyalty, and trust. I paused, looking out at faces that had become family to me, Chen Wei with his quiet wisdom, Doc Hayes with her steady compassion, young Sarah Crow Feather with her bright determination to bridge worlds. My sons Samuel and Daniel chose greed over love, murder over mercy. They killed innocent people, betrayed their own father, and tried to destroy the community that had raised them. In doing so, they broke my heart and nearly broke my spirit. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Many of them had lived through the crisis with us, but hearing it laid out so starkly still had the power to shock. But from that betrayal, from that fire that burned away everything I thought I knew about family, something new has grown, something stronger, more beautiful, more lasting than what came before. I gestured toward the building behind me, our ranch house transformed into classrooms and meeting halls, where children of all backgrounds learned together and adults gathered to solve problems with words instead of weapons. The Running Bear Community Center serves 43 families from 6 different cultural backgrounds. Our children are learning to read in 3 languages, to honor the traditions of all their ancestors, to see diversity as strength rather than division. Our adults are resolving disputes through mediation instead of violence, sharing resources instead of hoarding them, building bridges instead of walls. Governor Richards rose from his chair, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. Mrs. Clearwater, on behalf of Wyoming Territory, I want to officially recognize the Running Bear Community Center as our model for frontier integration. We're recommending that Congress adopt your methods as the standard for all new territorial settlements. The applause was thunderous, but I found myself thinking of Joseph Running Bear, whose vision had made all of this possible. His war axe still hung from my belt, but now it represented something different, not the weapon of a warrior, but the tool of a builder, someone who fought not to destroy but to create. There's something I want to share with all of you, I continued as the applause died down. A lesson I learned from my uncle Joseph Running Bear, who died protecting the truth that set us free. He used to say that when you lose everything you think you can't live without, you discover what you actually can't live without. Tom stepped up beside me, his hand finding mine with the easy comfort of 27 years of marriage. His hair was grayer now, his face more lined, but his eyes held a peace I'd never seen before. I thought I couldn't live without my sons, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I thought losing them would destroy me completely. But I discovered that what I actually can't live without is purpose, community, the chance to make tomorrow better than today. Those things can't be stolen or betrayed or murdered. They can only be given away freely, and in the giving, they multiply. Chief Standing Bear rose from his seat, his weathered face grave with the wisdom of 70 winters. Elizabeth Clearwater, daughter of 2 worlds, you have shown us that the strongest families are not those bound by blood, but those bound by choice. The Lakota Nation formally adopts you as our daughter, with all the rights and responsibilities that brings. The ceremony was followed by a feast that lasted until well past sunset, with foods from every culture represented in our community. Children played games that mixed Anglo and Native traditions, while adults shared stories in a dozen different languages. It was exactly the kind of celebration Joseph Running Bear had dreamed of, a gathering where differences were celebrated instead of feared. As the last guests departed under a star-filled Wyoming sky, Tom and I walked through our transformed home, marveling at how completely our lives had changed. The kitchen where we'd shared our last breakfast as a family now hosted community meetings. The parlor where we'd mourned Tom's fake death now echoed with children's laughter during school hours. "Do you ever regret it?" Tom asked as we settled onto our porch swing, the same one where we'd spent countless evenings planning our boys' futures. Giving up our private life to serve the community, I considered the question seriously. We'd sacrificed our quiet retirement, our peaceful old age, our dreams of grandchildren carrying on our family name, but in return, we'd gained something precious, the knowledge that our lives had meaning beyond our own happiness. "No," I said finally. "I regret what Samuel and Daniel became. I regret that Joseph had to die for justice to prevail. I regret the pain this community had to endure, but I don't regret what we've built from those ashes." A coyote howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the plains like a song of wild freedom. Once, that sound would have reminded me of danger, of the untamed forces that threatened frontier families. Now it sounded like music, like the voice of a land that had learned to embrace all its children. Sarah told me something interesting today, Tom said, pulling a letter from his vest pocket. She's been corresponding with teachers in other territories who want to visit and learn from our methods. There's talk of establishing similar centers in Colorado, Montana, even California. The idea that our small experiment in healing and hope might spread beyond Wyoming Territory filled me with quiet pride. Perhaps Samuel and Daniel's betrayal, terrible as it had been, would ultimately save other families from similar tragedies. Joseph would be proud, I said, touching the war axe at my belt. His vision of two worlds dancing together is spreading like ripples on a pond. As we sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge over the land we'd learned to love in entirely new ways, I realized that my story had come full circle. I'd begun as Elizabeth Clearwater, the sheriff's wife, a woman who tried to bridge two worlds through quiet example. I'd become Elizabeth Running Bear Clearwater, community leader, teacher, and keeper of a vision that refused to die. The telegram that had started this journey, "I am still alive. Trust no one," had been both true and false. Tom was alive, but the no one part had proven wrong. We'd learned to trust our community, our chosen family, the bonds that grew from shared purpose rather than shared blood. In the end, that trust had saved us all. 1 year after the dedication ceremony, I sat at the desk in what had once been Daniel's bedroom, now my private office where I handled correspondence with communities across the Western Territories. The morning sun streamed through windows that looked out over the schoolyard where children of 6 different backgrounds played together, their laughter echoing across the Wyoming plains like a promise of better days to come. Before me lay a stack of letters from places I'd never seen: Colorado mining towns, Montana cattle ranches, California farming settlements, all asking for guidance on how to build the kind of community we'd created here in Clearwater Township. Each letter represented families struggling with the same challenges we'd faced. People searching for ways to turn diversity from a source of conflict into a foundation of strength. But today I was writing a different kind of letter, one that would be sealed and stored in the territorial archives for future generations to read. Governor Richards had requested that I document our story not just as a historical record, but as a guide for those who would face similar challenges in the years to come. To those who come after us, I began, my pen moving steadily across the paper. My name is Elizabeth Running Bear Clearwater, and I write to you from the year 1888 from a place where two worlds learned to dance together instead of fighting. If you are reading this, you may be facing your own crisis of trust, your own moment when everything you believed about family, community, or justice has been shaken to its foundation. I want you to know that you are not alone, and that even the deepest betrayals can become the soil from which new hope grows. I paused, thinking of Samuel and Daniel, wondering what they might have become if they'd chosen a different path. Their graves lay in the Clearwater Township Cemetery, marked with simple stones that bore only their names and dates. Tom and I visited them sometimes, not to mourn the men they'd become, but to remember the children they'd once been and to pray that their story might serve as a warning to others. The first lesson I learned is this: blood does not make family. Choice does. The sons I raised with such love chose greed over loyalty, murder over mercy. But the community that surrounded us in our darkest hour chose to see us as family worth saving. They chose to rebuild rather than abandon, to trust rather than fear, to hope rather than despair. Through my window, I could see Tom working in the garden we'd planted where the old barn used to stand. His movements were slower now. The wounds from Samuel and Daniel's ambush had left him with permanent stiffness in his left shoulder, but his face held the contentment of a man who'd found his true calling. At 63, he'd become not just a sheriff, but a teacher, showing other lawmen how to serve diverse communities with fairness and respect. The second lesson is about forgiveness, not the kind that excuses evil, but the kind that refuses to let evil define your future. I will never forgive what Samuel and Daniel did to their father, to Joseph Running Bear, to the innocent man they murdered to fake Tom's death, but I have forgiven them for breaking my heart, because holding on to that pain would have prevented me from opening my heart to the larger family that was waiting to embrace us. Sarah Crow Feather appeared in the schoolyard, ringing the bell that called the children back from their morning recess. In the year since she'd arrived, she'd become like a daughter to Tom and me, filling some of the emptiness left by our son's betrayal. She was engaged now to young Marcus Webb, the telegraph operator who'd found the courage to tell the truth about Samuel's threatening messages. Their wedding would be the first ceremony held in our new community chapel, a building designed to honor the spiritual traditions of all our peoples. The third lesson is about the power of purpose. When I thought my life was about raising my own children, building my own family's prosperity, protecting my own happiness, I was vulnerable to despair when those things were destroyed. But when I discovered that my life was about building bridges between worlds, about creating a place where all children could thrive regardless of their heritage, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. A knock at my office door interrupted my writing. Chief Running Wolf entered, his weathered face serious but not troubled. At 70, he moved with the dignity of a man who'd seen his people through the worst of times and lived to witness the beginning of better days. "Elizabeth," he said, unsettling into the chair across from my desk, "the tribal council has made a decision about the memorial we discussed. For months, we'd been planning a permanent memorial to Joseph Running Bear, something that would honor his sacrifice and preserve his vision for future generations. The council had been debating whether it should be a traditional Lakota monument or something that reflected the multicultural community he'd died protecting. We want to build it here," Chief Running Wolf continued, "in the center of your schoolyard, where children from all our peoples will see it every day. It will be carved from local stone, with words in English, Lakota, and Crow, telling the story of a warrior who fought not to destroy his enemies, but to turn them into family." Tears blurred my vision as I imagined the monument, a permanent reminder that the best battles are fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, not for conquest, but for understanding. The fourth and final lesson I want to share is this: never underestimate the power of small acts of courage. Joseph Running Bear was not a famous chief or a wealthy man. He was simply an elder who chose to help when help was needed, to speak truth when truth was dangerous, to stand up for justice even when it cost him his life. But his courage inspired others to be courageous. His sacrifice gave meaning to our survival, and his vision continues to spread across the territories like seeds on the wind. I finished the letter as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the schoolyard where our memorial would soon stand. Through the window, I could see the children returning to their afternoon lessons: Anglo, Lakota, Crow, Chinese, and mixed heritage children like I had been, all learning together that their differences were gifts to be celebrated, not barriers to be overcome. To those who come after us, I leave you this promise: no matter how dark your night, no matter how complete your betrayal, and no matter how impossible your situation seems, there is always hope. There are always people willing to help if you have the courage to trust them. There is always a chance to build something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. The telegraph that started my journey said, "I am still alive, trust no one." But I learned that while the first part was true, love, hope, justice, and community are indeed still alive, no matter how badly they've been wounded, the second part was wrong. We can trust. We must trust. And in that trust, we find not just survival, but the possibility of transformation. With hope for your future and gratitude for the privilege of serving mine. Elizabeth Running Bear, Clearwater. Clearwater Township, Wyoming Territory, 1888. As I sealed the letter and prepared it for the territorial archives, I realized that my story had become something larger than one woman's journey through betrayal and loss. It had become a testament to the power of community, the possibility of forgiveness, and the truth that even the worst tragedies can become the foundation for something beautiful. The telegraph from the dead had brought me not just the news that Tom was alive, but the knowledge that hope itself could never truly die. It might be wounded, buried, forgotten for a time, but it would always find a way to rise again, stronger and more beautiful than before. And in that rising, we find the courage to trust again, to love again, to build again, not just for ourselves, but for all those who will come after us, walking the paths we've cleared through the wilderness of the human heart. 2 years after that terrible day when I received a telegraph from my supposedly dead husband, I stood once again in the Clearwater Township Cemetery. But this time, I wasn't alone with grief and betrayal. Tom walked beside me, his hand steady in mine, while behind us came a procession of nearly 200 people, the entire community that had grown from the ashes of our family's destruction. Today marked the dedication of Joseph Running Bear's memorial, but it felt like something more: the final healing of wounds that had once seemed too deep to mend. The monument stood 8 feet tall, carved from Wyoming granite by craftsmen from 3 different cultures working together. Lakota symbols of wisdom and courage intertwined with Crow representations of justice and peace, while English words told the story of a warrior who had died not to defeat enemies, but to transform them into family. Here lies Joseph Running Bear. I read aloud from the inscription, Elder, Warrior, Bridge Builder. He died so that 2 worlds might learn to dance as one. Below those words, carved in 3 languages, was his final message to me. The old ways and the new ways must learn to dance together, or both will die. Chief Running Wolf stepped forward, his aged hands steady as he placed an eagle feather at the base of the monument. Joseph Running Bear's vision lives on in every child who learns in your schoolhouse, in every dispute settled with words instead of weapons, in every family that chooses love over fear. Governor Richards, who had returned from Cheyenne specifically for this ceremony, addressed the gathered crowd. What you have built here in Clearwater Township has become the model for territorial integration across the American West. Delegations from 12 territories have visited to study your methods. The Running Bear Community Centers now operating in Colorado, Montana, and California all trace their inspiration to this place, to this community, to the courage of people who refuse to let tragedy have the final word. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to drift toward the community feast that would follow, I found myself drawn back to the graves of Samuel and Daniel. Their headstones looked small and lonely compared to Joseph's magnificent memorial. But I no longer felt anger when I looked at them, only a deep sadness for the choices they had made and the lives they had wasted. "Do you ever wonder what they would think of all this?" Tom asked, following my gaze to our sons' graves. "I think they would be amazed," I said honestly. They saw our community as something to exploit, our diversity as weakness to be manipulated. They never understood that what they tried to destroy was actually indestructible, the human capacity to choose love over fear, trust over suspicion, hope over despair. Sarah Crowfeather approached with her husband Marcus, their 6-month-old daughter sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Little Elizabeth Running Bear Webb, named for both me and Joseph, represented everything our community had become: a bridge between worlds, a symbol of hope, a promise that the future would be better than the past. "Mrs. Clearwater," Sarah said, "I wanted you to know that we received another letter yesterday from a community in Wyoming Territory. They're facing conflicts between logging families and the local tribal nation, and they want to establish their own Running Bear Community Center." The news filled me with quiet satisfaction. Joseph's vision was spreading like ripples on a pond, reaching places and people we'd never imagined. Each new center represented families who wouldn't have to endure what we'd endured, children who would grow up seeing diversity as strength rather than division. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about the telegram that had started this entire journey. "I am still alive. Trust no one." Those words had seemed like a message from the dead, an impossible communication from beyond the grave. Now I understood that they had been something different entirely, a message from the future, a promise that life and love and justice would survive no matter how badly they were wounded. Tom was still alive, healthier and happier than he'd been in years. Our community was more alive than ever, thriving in ways we'd never imagined possible. The trust we'd learned to place in our chosen family had been rewarded 100-fold. But perhaps most importantly, I was still alive, not just breathing, but truly living with a purpose that filled every day with meaning. The woman who had stood beside a fake grave 2 years ago, shattered by betrayal and consumed with grief, had been transformed into someone I barely recognized: a leader, a teacher, a keeper of wisdom, a builder of bridges between worlds. "Grandmother Elizabeth," little Mary Patterson called out, using the honorary title the community's children had given me. "Will you tell us the story again about how the telegraph from heaven saved our town?" I smiled at her innocent interpretation of events. To the children who had grown up in our integrated community, the idea that a dead man could send messages to protect his family seemed perfectly reasonable. They lived in a world where impossible things happened every day, where former enemies became friends, where different cultures created beautiful harmony, where love proved stronger than hate. "Yes, child," I said, settling onto one of the benches that surrounded Joseph's memorial. "I'll tell you the story. But remember, it's not just my story, it's all of our stories. It's the story of what happens when good people choose to stand together against evil, when communities decide that love is stronger than fear." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I gathered the children around me and began to speak. I told them about betrayal and forgiveness, about loss and discovery, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. But most of all, I told them about hope, how it can survive the worst betrayals, how it can grow from the ashes of the deepest tragedies, how it can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The most important thing to remember, I concluded as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, is that no matter how dark things seem, no matter how badly people disappoint you, no matter how impossible your situation appears, there is always hope. There are always good people willing to help if you have the courage to trust them. And there is always the possibility that tomorrow can be better than today. The children dispersed to their families, carrying with them the story that would become part of their own heritage, part of the wisdom they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. And I sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the community that had become my true family, grateful for the journey that had brought us all to this moment of peace. The telegraph from the dead had delivered its message: love lives, hope endures, and trust, carefully given and faithfully kept, can transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. In the end, that was all any of us could ask for, the chance to turn our pain into purpose, our losses into lessons, our tragedies into triumphs that would inspire others long after we were gone. The circle had closed, but the story would continue forever.